me start off and just say that for us at SATS, we've said that we want to look at quite a diverse pool of topics this year, and this is what we've set out to do. And the question today on what science can't see, basically Don will try to show us that intellectuals seem to think that science is the most rational way of explaining everything in the known universe. But there is a certain measure that science can predict, but there's also a measure that science cannot predict. And I don't want to say what he's going to say because I've never seen this presentation, but I'm quite excited because I know that this is going to be quite edifying to you where you are at. Don is the Director of Research of Development for Norman Geisler International Ministries. He has a master's degree in Biblical and Theological Studies from Luther Rice University, and also a Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. And like he said earlier, he is pursuing a PhD in Islamic studies with Columbia University International. It's still, Don, I'm not sure, is it still Columbia?
Columbia International is the new one. Yeah, it was Northwest at Potchefstroom. Now it's Columbia International.
Okay, excellent. Well, Don, welcome. Over to you. And I am not going to take any more time. We've got listeners, and I'm going to give over to you to do your presentation. Be blessed, brother.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, brother. Thank you for the introduction. As he said, I am Don Deal, and what we're going to talk about today is what science can't see. Science, like anything else in the academic world, has a certain set of rules and traditions they use when they're trying to decide what counts as evidence, what counts as convincing, what counts as science. And we're going to examine some of those and see that some of these statements from scientists have nothing to do with science. And we're not going to get into too many of the controversial statements, but perhaps some of you may know some of them and you realize, I hope after this presentation, a better way to handle it. I'm not sure how the questions will be asked, but feel free to ask questions as we go along. But there's a Q&A session at the end. If you can wait to the end, please wait to the end. But otherwise, you can type in your question, and I'll get to it as soon as possible. All right. Is science the only way to know the truth? This is Dr. Jerry Coyne. He's an evolutionary biologist in the U.S., and he loves to give talks about the superiority of science to other fields as far as ways of knowing things. And his lecture this is an actual photo from an actual lecture he gave at the Indian Academy of Sciences called Ways of Knowing Science versus Everything Else. I can tell you that his conclusion was that if you're doing science, you're learning something. If you're doing anything else, you're giving opinions. The only way of knowing, according to Dr. Coyne, is to know through science. And the other fields can know something as long as they use scientific methodology. And we're going to get a little bit of that, what that scientific methodology is as we go along here. This is what we're going to talk about this morning, well, for me this morning, for you this afternoon. What science is, what science is not, what science can't see, what Christianity can see. We'll have a quick conclusion and then open it up for a Q&A session. All right, what is science? It's the definition, according to the dictionary I consulted, is it's the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. I'll say that again because there's several key words here. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And a few words, key words there are the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And you can see by definition, supernatural is going to be a difficulty for this. So how do they do this? Well, they use the scientific method. And the scientific method is simply you start off with a question or a problem that you're trying to address. You do a little basic research, and from that basic research, you come up with a hypothesis. From the hypothesis, based on the hypothesis, you determine what experiments could validate or invalidate the original idea. And then once you finish the experiment and complete it, you do an analysis, and that may in turn lead you to further research, which is the upper arrow in the analysis box, and a new hypothesis and a new experiment, and that continues to the point where you've satisfactorily answered the question through the analysis, the experiments and analysis, and then you reach the conclusion. And it says, of course, and win the science fair, because that's quite important. All right. It works through, now I think a key bit of information for Christians to know, or anyone who has any questions about when scientists start to make these grand pronouncements about the death of religion or the goal of ending religion. You know, I can think of specifically, there was a physicist on CNN here in the U.S. who, when they first announced the finding of the Higgs boson, they called the God particle, the host asked him, said, does this finding mean the end of religion? And the physicist said, and more, as if finding a subatomic particle is going to end all religion on Earth. Clearly not the case. But we need to understand the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And it says, no matter how unrealistic that sounds, in many fields such as science and law, proof simply doesn't exist. There can only be facts and evidence that lead you to certain conclusions. And science typically uses the combination of inductive and deductive reasoning. Someone who uses inductive reasoning makes specific observations and then draws a general conclusion. If that sounds like science, that's because science proceeds primarily through inductive reasoning. And then deductive reasoning, specific conclusion follows a general theory. That is, they take the information they gain through their inductive study and they form a general theory, which can become a law if it's a universally accepted theory of how the universe works. Now, induction, it kind of works like this in science. Suppose my theory is that all swans are white. And I go through every swan in South Africa, and they're all white. I start off with the first 300 swans I study. After 300 swans, my theory isn't proven, but it is supported. But my level of confidence in the conclusion is fairly low at 300 swans I study. As I complete the study of all the swans in South Africa, my confidence that all swans are white is much greater. If I then study all the swans in the continent of Africa and they're all white, then my confidence is that much higher, but it can never be 100%, because as long as you could go to a new location and you have the possibility of finding a black or brown swan, then you can never reach 100% satisfactory answer that you've proven anything. This is not like mathematics or anything of that sort, where you can start from certain premises and reach a specific conclusion. It's not at all like geometry, which uses deductive reasoning. This is inductive reasoning. You build a case. If you use deductive reasoning correctly, then the conclusion follows necessarily. Deductive reasoning, typically we think in terms of two premises and a conclusion. And if the two premises for the statement, such as all men are mortal, Rudolph is a man, conclusion, therefore Rudolph is mortal. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion, if you follow the form of the logic correctly, is a necessary conclusion. In deductive reasoning, if you don't agree with it, either you have to prove that one of the premises was false, the form was wrong, but if the premises are true and the form is correct, then by definition you are irrational to not accept the conclusion. Inductive reasoning, the type of reasoning science uses, leads to percentages. It leads to levels of confidence, and we'll get into some specific examples here in just a moment. So I think the takeaway in this situation is that scientific knowledge is always partial and provisional. That is, unless a scientist can be at all places at all times in the universe, then the knowledge is partial and it's provisional. That is, it's subject to change. In the old theological language, it's corrigible. It's able to be changed. You can think about how Newton understood gravity, and it worked quite well, and it still works quite well. When you're doing ballistic studies and for the military to launch cannonballs or to shoot mortar shells, then Newtonian physics worked perfectly well. But Albert Einstein expanded that understanding to include very massive and objects and objects moving at very high speeds. And so that the original thesis of Newton was incomplete, and Einstein expanded it. So it's always provisional. Anything we think we know now could be different in the future if we discover something new. And that's particularly so the case of quantum mechanics, the study of the very small, the subatomic world, because there are new things. They have what they call the Standard Model, which includes, last time I checked, more than 30 subatomic particles identified. And they just found a new one just a couple of years ago. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. The second point to understand about how science works is that everything it studies must be measurable and repeatable. That is how science works. It measures things. If you cannot measure it and you cannot repeat the experiment, then it's not science. It may be something else. It may be an academic field, but it's not science. And the final point, and I think this is the key point to understand in how science proceeds, is that it utilizes methodological naturalism. If I had a podium and a wooden floor, I'd be stomping my foot now as a reminder to everyone in the audience that they need to remember this point. Science utilizes methodological naturalism. That means, as a methodology, as their scientific, as they do their science, the method is to assume natural causes for everything. That is, you can only, everything has to be assumed to be natural, and that is because God's not measurable. God's not willing to take part in experiments. So originally it started as a way to test things within this natural world that we live, the physical world that we live. And so they use methodological naturalism. The difficulty with some scientists who are anti-religion is that they confuse methodological naturalism, that is, science doesn't make reference to magic or to the supernatural, methodological naturalism, they confuse that with philosophical naturalism. That is, they confuse the methods of science, the limitations of science, the limitations of the scientific method. They confuse that with an understanding of all that is. They don't understand science well enough. They understand their branch of science far better than I ever will, the scientists do, but they don't understand science as it's writ large, so to speak. I hope that's clear. All right. Einstein's general theory of relativity. This is just an example of how this works. In 1915, Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity. If you some people may remember, in 1905, Einstein published his special theory of relativity, the E equals mc squared, the speed of light type stuff we talked about, or that people have talked about since that time. But in 1915, he released his general theory of relativity, and the general theory of relativity takes the special theories, the thing that his findings from 1905, and it expands it from a special case to the general how the universe works. So basically, Einstein added gravity to his theory of relativity, and such that his understanding of gravity is that massive objects warp space-time, and that's what that picture is kind of showing. The mass of the Earth is warping the space-time around it, and the more massive the object, the more it warps it. And This theory was first verified in 1918 when they did they were looking at a star that was on the far side of the sun, and they were trying to see how much the sun bent the light of the star. Would it appear in a slightly different location than it should? Now, you can't look at something right past the sun normally because the brightness of the sun. So there was a solar eclipse that in 1918, and using the solar eclipse to block out the sun, they were able to measure that the star's position had been moved slightly due to the warping of the space by the sun. Now, since then, this theory's been proven many, many times over. I can show you photos of Einstein crosses as galaxies warp the light, the space around them so much you can see the galaxies behind them being twisted in different shapes and such, that the appearance of it, there is much evidence that Einstein's theory is the correct understanding. Well, how far? Well, they say that Newton's theory was demonstrated to be accurate to 7 decimal places. That is, Newton's theory was accurate to 99.99999 until you get to 7 decimal places after the decimal place. Well, so at this time, Einstein's theory has been proven out to 18 decimal places, 99.9999999 to get 18 nines. And but what's interesting is that this is the most demonstrated, the most accurate theory ever come up with in science, but it's not 100%. You can't reach 100% unless you can look everywhere in the universe at all times. So science is provisional. That is, if even though it's 99, Einstein's general theory of relativity is correct at 99.99999, etc., it's not 100% proven, because next year we may discover something new that causes the scientists to have to redo the theory or modify the theory. It's never 100% in science. This is a representation of the discovery of the Higgs boson. That was it was a subatomic particle, part of the universe on a very small scale. It was first postulated by Dr. Peter Higgs in 1964. He was trying to come up with a way to explain why there's mass in the universe. Why anything? Well, I mean, we feel mass in terms of usually gravity and weight, but mass has a slightly different meaning than that. But why does anything have mass? And they postulated this idea that there's a Higgs, well, they call it now the Higgs field, which gives subatomic particles mass. The particles that interact with the Higgs field have mass, and the ones that don't have mass. So that a photon, a light particle, as it's traveling through space, does not interact with the Higgs field, and therefore it's massless. Every other subatomic particle we measure has mass, and therefore when you have a conglomeration of when you put them all together to make macro objects like apples or cars or people, we have mass. Planets have mass, and they postulate it's because of the Higgs field. And every field has a force-carrying particle, and in this case, they postulated the idea of the Higgs boson. Well, they tested at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland, and after 2 years of testing, they made the announcement. They were very excited. They had found the Higgs particle. They found what some people popularly called the God particle. That's because a book came out many years ago which called it that, because it was hidden from view, such as God. And at the announcement, they said, "We found it," and they were popping champagne, and everyone was laughing and hugging. And they had Peter Higgs there, and he was in tears, and it says, "We've found it. It's been identified to a certainty of 5 sigma." And 5 sigma, most people who don't speak science don't know what that means. A sigma is a standard deviation. So 1 sigma would be 1 standard deviation, which means you have a confidence level of about 80 or 85%. And as you go up to 2, 3, or 4 sigma, 2, 3, or 4 standard deviations, the odds of you being wrong go down. You're more and more certain. So when they announced they had found the particle to a certainty of 5 sigma, that meant there's a 1 in 3.5 million chance that they're wrong. That there's never 100% certainty in science, but there's a 1.5, 3. There's only a 1 in 3.5 million chance that they're wrong. So science is never certain. It can be very, very confident, but when you hear science proves, you can be certain that whoever's saying that has no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand science. Scientists who study those fields don't use those terms. This is another important aspect of how modern science proceeds. This is that same fella I showed you earlier. This is Jerry Coyne. He's the evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book, Why Evolution is True. And Richard Dawkins, of course, the atheist, because Jerry Coyne's an atheist, wrote Compelling, Masterful, Outstandingly Good. Richard Dawkins loves books by other atheists. And this is what he said about the theory of evolution in that book, this atheist. He said, despite 1 million chances to be wrong, evolution always comes up right. That is as close as we can get to scientific truth. Notice he's saying it says evolution is true on the title, but he says it's as close as we can get. It's what the particle scientists called verisimilitude. It's a fancy word that just simply means as close, as close to the truth as we can get. You can never get absolute certainty in science. It just doesn't exist. Oh, interesting. That slide didn't come over very well. Can I do that or I have to go? Oh, that doesn't work. Okay. I'll tell you what that was supposed to say. It says science. What is not science? Science is not history. That history is a field of study, but it's not science. It's not art. Science is art is a different field. Painting, poetry, fiction writing, etc. That's different than science. Religion is not science because we can use scientific methodology, but religion itself is not a scientific field. And philosophy is not science. Those are all not science. And I apologize. I tried to make a really cute slide and it doesn't come across in this format. Alrighty. So what can science not see? Well, we're losing some of my cool special effects on these slides, but science can't see love. Now, this diagram comes directly from a scientific website that's describing the science of love. And this is some of the verbiage. In the top left of the diagram, you see lust. Lust is determined by sex hormones, the testes and the ovaries that are released. That's where the lust part of love comes from, according to science. Attraction comes from the release of dopamine and the hypothalamus in the brain. The attachment for the long-term part, such as you want to be around people for a while, is a release of oxytocin and vasopressin, which is in the hypothalamus. And there on section D, you can see the prefrontal cortex, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. You can see those are the locations where love comes from. And this is some of the verbiage. I'll read it directly out of it for you. Science has identified 3 basic parts of love, each driven by a unique blend of brain chemicals. Lust is governed by both estrogen and testosterone in both men and women. Attraction is driven by adrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin, the same chemicals that are released by exciting, novel experiences. Long-term attachment is governed by a very different set of hormones and brain chemicals, oxytocin and vasopressin, which encourage bonding, Interestingly, oxytocin is known as the cuddle hormone and is the hormone that drives the bond between mother and child. Each of these chemicals work in a specific part of the brain to influence lust, attraction, and attachment. And this is what the scientist's final statement was. It's a work in progress, and there are many questions left unanswered, but in the end, everyone is capable of defining love for themselves. And for better or worse, if it's all hormones, maybe each of us can have chemistry with just about anyone. But whether or not it goes further is still up to the rest of you. What you see here is somebody taking methodological naturalism, that is, you only study the natural world with the assumption that everything has physical causes, and turning humans into a sort of meat puppet, into a sort of machinery. That is, our brains react to these hormones being released, and we can't help it. We're basically robots who are driven by our hormones to feel this biochemical illusion called love. We call it love. We think it's something important, but it's not really. It's just chemicals in the brain. And this leads to what is commonly known as anyway, the term escapes me right now. But anyway, can science answer questions like, does my wife love me? No, that's not answerable by science. But you see, when you take the limitations that science gives, which is you have to use methodological naturalism, well, you can't take anything like a spirit or a soul that could not be driven by chemical means. And they don't see that as we, as a person, complete person, fall in love, that these hormones are released. They see the hormones being released causing the illusion of love. That is, they have the causality, in my mind, backwards. They have the chemical reactions causing emotional reactions. And I think that there's no way they could possibly know this is the whole story. And they admit as much when they say it's a work in progress. Well, they can't see, science can't see love. They can see the chemical reactions. Science can't see moral values. And this is once again from Jerry Coyne, the atheist. He says, evil is a human name given to things reducing our well-being that are the inevitable byproducts of the laws of physics, including evolution. Some humans have genes or past environments that make them do bad things. It's very interesting that they define good and bad as what reduces our well-being. It kind of begs the question, is human well-being, is that defined by quality of life? How do you define that? Is having the most number of humans alive at one time the best result, or is having fewer humans who have more property the better result? There's no standard for this. It's left up to the individual to decide what's right or wrong. But he tries to give it a scientific sounding explanation with certain question-begging statements about they do bad things because they're driven by their chemistry, their genes, or past environments. Well, this has a serious problem. If our moral values are determined by our genes, then one, how do you change a person's mind if their genes are what determines their moral values? What are you going to do? Change my genetic structure when we have a discussion? And if the genes are the cause of our behaviors, then why do we have prisons and courts? You just do a genetic test, you just analyze the DNA, you determine who has what, and you go ahead and get rid of those people to start with. Why bother to wait till they commit the crimes? Wouldn't it be better just go ahead and use the genetic information that's going to determine your behavior? And he says our past environments that make them do things. So you see, either case, he's reduced humans to simple puppets that are being driven along by the forces of nature. That's not the way the world works. So let's ask this question: is rape wrong? Science can show there are physical and psychological effects from rape, but if it aids survival, how can it be wrong? If the whole purpose of the evolutionary history of the world, according to these scientists, if the whole purpose of the evolutionary process is that we're have our built-in, that we dance to our genes, that we dance to the music they make in order to keep the genes propagating our species, then how is rape wrong? You have to decide that people have intrinsic value to make that determination, and there's no way to do that on a purely natural perspective. Is slavery wrong? What science can determine if slavery is wrong? You can determine that some more people are maybe happy or unhappy. You could do surveys of them, but they can't tell you whether the institution itself is wrong. Is racism wrong? Well, by scientific values, I'll give you a specific example. After Darwin's theory of evolution became popular, they began to do what they call social Darwinism, where they began to divide the races up into levels of evolutionary sophistication. And they, of course, the European scientists who did that put the white people at the top. Well, what happens when you get someone like Hitler involved, and Hitler decides that the Jews are holding back the next stage of human evolution? Well, he gets rid of them. Wants to tell him he's wrong on a scientific perspective. Well, there's nothing that from a scientific perspective that can tell him that. Science can't see science. How interesting is this? The philosophy of science is not science. It's a field of philosophy. What is science? If you want to know what is physics or what is chemistry, studying chemistry will tell you what scientists study, but it doesn't define chemistry, the field of chemistry. It takes a philosophy of science to tell you what is and isn't chemistry. Is transmutation of lead into gold, is that chemistry? Is phrenology, is measuring bumps on your head to determine personality, is that science? Well, that isn't determined within the science. It's the philosophy of science that answers that question. And science can't see science. Science proceeds generally with the philosophy of empiricism. And empiricism says all knowledge comes from sense experience. Can that be proven, that all knowledge comes from sense experience? How about numbers? Is 5 plus 7 always 12? Well, I'm pretty sure, I'm actually certain 5 plus 7 is always 12. What sense experience can prove that? Well, none. Well, science can't see science in the empiricism problem. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said causality is never observed. He said, we never actually see, this is what another scientist said, we never actually see a cause. We see one event followed by another, but we cannot experience in any way the necessity of the procession of events. In philosophical terms, we see a succession of events. Ball A moves after ball B strikes it, but we don't see the causation. Remember, Hume was being a consistent empiricist. You cannot see causation. Do scientists believe in causation? Absolutely. But they can't do that from an empiricist philosophy, from a philosophy that says everything comes from sense experience. And that's where they get into problem with discussions of God, as we'll see in a few minutes. Well, what about the idea of the uniformity of nature? Is that based on our sense experience? Well, there's no way on an empirical and non-question begging way to believe the future is going to be like the past. No matter what, we don't have any experience of the future until we're there. So we cannot make it based on the principles of empiricism. We can't make any predictions about the future. We have no future. We have no certainty about the future. In terms of empiricism, an antitoxin that cures today may turn into poison tomorrow. You don't know based on using only empiricist ways of thinking. It takes other ways of thinking, and scientists are typically, especially physicists, trapped into that empiricist way of thinking, and they're aware of the strengths of it, which is that you can confirm so many things through testing, but they're not aware of the weaknesses of it, which is that they have to assume a lot that their philosophy doesn't allow. Science can't see beauty. There's actually a neuroscience of beauty. It's called neuroaesthetics. It says that human neurology and evolution demonstrate there's no difference between beauty and non-beauty. It's a remnant of some adaptation that aided survival in ancient man, perhaps by making some people appear more attractive or making some more useful objects appear more beautiful. It tricked us, in a sense, into surviving. Our brains are mechanisms according to this way of thinking, and such that there is no difference for science between beauty and non-beauty, because there's nothing to be measured or tested in itself. There's only human reactions that can be measured and tested. Science can't see the self. How can we know that that there's a self here in my, they say that every 7 years, every cell in your body has been replaced. Well, or they can't see that self. Science cannot see it. As I age and change, my opinions are not the same opinions at age 60, or not the same opinions I had at age 20. My feelings have changed on many things, but who is the me that endures and doesn't change? Who is the Don that has never changed, that is just a collection of cells? Well, that's all that science can see, is the cells. Science can see a human being, but it cannot see you. Think about it this way. This is an example from C.S. Lewis. Science can observe a man looking through the window of a garden shed at the sunlight going through the dust, and they can observe him and say his eyes appear to be moving about between plants and animals, and looking at the sun. That's what science could say about the man, but they can't experience what the man is experiencing, the beauty and the joy that he's getting through looking at those objects and the reaction it causes in him. They can't see the self that's in there. They can only see the outside. And because of this, because of a mechanical understanding of how humans work, what you end up with is a person's value and their nature as being determined by their functionality. A person is as valuable as what they do. And because of that, for many people of this kind of way of thinking, abortion is simply the elimination of some cells that haven't become a person yet, because that baby hasn't functioned, and therefore the essence of the person is their importance is based on their functionality. And since the preborn baby has not functioned in any way, it's perfectly okay to remove it. And that's kind of what that leads to. You can see there's all kinds of consequences for this. What science can't see? Science can't see justice. And if you look up the definition of justice, you'll see how much question begging goes on there. Justice in its broadest context includes both the attainment of that which is just. How's that for a definition? Justice is the attainment of that which is just. Sunshine is looking at that which is coming from the sun. Is the just, and the philosophical discussion of what is just. Concept of justice is this is right out of the dictionary, by the way. The concept of justice is based on numerous fields and many different viewpoints and perspectives, including the concepts of moral correctness based on ethics, rationality, law, religion, equity, and fairness. Often the general discussion of justice is divided into the realm of social justice, as found in philosophy, theology, and religion, and procedural justice is found in the study and application of the law. The concept of justice is different in different cultures. Stephen Jay Gould was a U.S. Harvard educated paleontologist and geologist. And he said, science can tell us what societies believe is just, but science cannot tell us what is just. It's a different thing. Science cannot see justice. Science, of course, can't see God and the supernatural. How could a field of study dedicated to the natural world make any determinations about the supernatural? How could a field whose methods, including testing, how could it test God? Scientists often make statements about God or religion, but they're doing so as rank amateurs, not as scientists. Science studies the natural world. God is not part of the natural world, and therefore science can tell us nothing about God and the supernatural. And I see somehow that slide got goofed up. It's actually supernatural, not supernatural. So what can Christianity see that science can't see? Well, in the New Testament, it uses what is love. Christianity can see what love is and what in its actuality. In the New Testament, of course, there's 4 Greek words translated as love. There's storge, which is affection, like you have for your dog or your pets. Philia or phileo, which is friendship, brotherly love. Eros, which is sexual or erotic love. And agape, which is unconditional, divine, selfless love. The ultimate source of love for Christians is God's nature. God is love. 1 John 4:8 describes one of God's many primary attributes as love. It says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. God is love. Love is more. The word I was looking for earlier was cognitive dissonance. The atheist scientist who studies love as a chemical reaction and thinks that it's all just a biochemical illusion designed to ensure the propagation of our species really does love their wife or husband or children, but they think the rational side of their brain says this is all a chemical illusion, and the experiential side experiences love. And so they know it's something more, but because it cannot be measured or tested in that sense, it's not part of science. Christianity can see moral values. These moral values that we talk about proceed from God's nature. We know about God's design for the universe and his design for mankind through the special revelation, particularly the law in the Old Testament reveals God's nature, and through natural law, that as you study the animal kingdom and you see how things and how nature works, and you work out laws through that way. Evil, in this definition, is a privation. It's not a thing. Privation is a lack of something that should be there. For example, the shirt I'm wearing has about 9 holes in it. Most of those are for buttons. Some of the holes are for my arms and for my neck. But if it has additional holes in the back or other places it shouldn't be, that's a privation. That's a lack of something that should be there. Evil is parasitic in this definition on good. If goodness did not exist, if a good shirt did not exist, you could not have a bad shirt. You could not have 100% bad shirt, because that would be nothing. Christianity and philosophers can see something science can't see. We can see science. We can see the whole world, not just the physical side. We can justify knowledge of the unseen, numbers, moral values, etc., as being grounded in the knowledge or essence of God. We can see the physical world and more. As C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite writers, said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So we can see science. It's interesting that science did not grow in the Middle East, did not grow in India or the Far East and in China. Why? Why was it birthed in Europe? Well, there's a philosophical background that allowed Europe to first develop these principles. That is, number one, God created everything. A personal God created everything in the physical universe. And number two, he made us in his image, not a physical image, but in a mental and moral likeness, such that we can now take apart what he created and see how it works. If you're in, say, the Hindu part of the world, then everything works because it is God. If you're in the any part of the world that follows that sort of pantheistic thinking, there's no motivation to take it apart. In the Islamic world, there's a sort of determinism that's always been there, and a philosophy of occasionalism, which basically says that God directly controls everything. So you don't have to worry about how it works because it doesn't work on its own in that part of the world. So science grew up out of a Christian, Judeo-Christian European background because of that background. What can we see that science can't see? We can see beauty in that piece of artwork there. I've actually seen it. It's in Italy. It's a solid block of marble that was carved into the Christ in the tomb by the artist Idea. We can see beauty. Beauty is the way that our spirits rejoice in God's creation. Just as the angels sang with joy. If you think about Job 38:7, it said, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. That was describing creation. The joy that we feel when we see beauty, we recognize beauty, we recognize ugliness. It's not a scientific concept. It hasn't been and never could be. The self. Now, science, we discussed the limitations of science, but we can look at each other, and what we see is not objects to be manipulated for our own purposes, but other people made in God's image whose value is intrinsic. It's built into them. They have intrinsic worth. Now, Christians have split over the centuries, understanding exactly how the human being works, but there's always a spiritual aspect, call it soul, spirit, body. Some have come to kind of this is through the Platonic side, kind of a mind-body dualism where there's a body that the soul inhabits. And some have come to the more Aristotelian way of looking at it and see the humans as hylomorphism, that is form and matter combination, such that the soul is the form of the body and there's not it's not separable from the body. That is that humans are a blending of the soul and body, and the soul is not directly separable. So there's been different Christian interpretations, but it's always seen humans as more than just physically, mechanically determined people, but as something beyond that with a spirit or a soul. We can see ourselves through intentionality and self-reflection. Intentionality means you intend to do something. That's not explainable on a mechanistic view of the human. And self-reflection, we can sit and think about ourselves. We can conceive of the whole universe in our minds. We know what it's like to express and experience our feelings. We are made in God's image, and life is holy in its essence. It's not based on the function that we perform. And finally, Christians can see justice. I'm sorry, not finally, but Christians can see justice. If you notice in the Bible, it talks an awful lot about justice. We can believe and work towards true justice, not a popular justice, but the actual objectively true justice, because we can ground our conception of justice in our knowledge of God. Atheists, by the way, I don't believe should ever ask for true justice. Can you imagine standing before God and asking him to be just to us based on how we've lived our lives? I pray for mercy. I don't pray for justice. And finally, we can see the whole world, not just the physical side. We can see God in the supernatural. We can justify knowledge of the unseen, numbers, moral values, etc., as being grounded in the knowledge or essence of God. We can see the physical world and more. We can rely on our reasoning capabilities to lead to truth because we're not just a meat machine. There's an American philosopher whose name's escaping me right now, but I've got his face in my mind. He said, if we're the result of evolution, then our mental capabilities are constructed towards survival, not towards truth. That is, that there's no reason to believe that we reach truth. What's the conclusion? And that's a lot of stuff we covered today. Science can't see what love is in its totality. It cannot justify moral values. Science can't even see itself. That's philosophy of science. Science cannot see beauty. It cannot see the self. Science cannot understand justice or see God in the supernatural. How can a field that is supposed to lead to knowledge start by ruling out so much a priori without even looking? The goal of science is knowledge, but within strict confines. It limits itself to what is testable and measurable.